Was his Bible? Oh, this is precious.
No. I think it says 1957.
1957.
Yeah.
Okay.
For nearly 50 years, a climate-controlled steel vault in the deepest recesses of Graceland held a secret the Presley estate refused to release. It was Elvis's most private possession, his personal Bible. 2 weeks ago, archivist hands finally turned the key. What they found inside has left forensic historians entirely speechless. This was no ordinary book of faith. The margins are flooded with a desperate, trembling diary written in the dark. One final, chilling message, scrawled just hours before his heart stopped, changes everything we know about his tragic end. The locked vault of Graceland. A pair of white cotton gloves snapped against a researcher's wrist. The sound echoed sharply off the concrete walls of the archive basement. Below the glittering mansion of Graceland lies a bunker built of reinforced steel. This room holds the items the public never sees. It houses old tax documents, dental records, and worn leather suitcases. For decades, the most guarded item sat on shelf number 12. It was a heavy black box with a dual combination lock. The estate employees called it the dead zone. No one opened it without written permission from the top executives. Why keep a simple book under such extreme security? The answer lay inside the leather binding. The lead archivist entered the code into the digital keypad. The heavy steel door groaned as the seal broke. The air inside smelled faintly of vinegar and old glue. On the center table sat the black box. The team had spent 3 months securing the legal rights to open it. Historians always assumed Elvis Presley left his final thoughts in a standard diary. They searched his nightstands in 1977. They checked his dressing rooms. They found absolutely nothing. Where did a man under constant surveillance hide his deepest secrets? He hid them in plain sight. He used the book he read every single night. The box clicked open. The archivist lifted a thick volume wrapped in tissue paper. It was a King James Study Bible from 1970. The spine was completely broken. The black leather was rubbed raw at the corners from years of heavy travel. Gold foil lettering on the front read, Elvis A. Presley. This book traveled in a custom briefcase to every hotel room in Las Vegas. It sat on the edge of his bed during his final morning on Earth. The sheer weight of the book felt different to the researchers. It felt dense. The first question the team needed to answer was simple. Did Elvis actually write these notes himself? Many celebrities use ghostwriters or secretaries for their personal correspondence. The team brought in a specialized forensic document examiner. She positioned an ultraviolet light bar over the opened cover. The black ink under the light did not match standard office pens of the era. It was a cheap ballpoint ink filled with high levels of industrial copper. Elvis bought these exact pens by the box from a local Memphis supply store. The handwriting on the opening page was large and erratic. It sloped downward toward the bottom right corner of the paper. This physical trait indicates extreme physical exhaustion. The examiner compared the curves of the capital letters to his signature on the 1973 divorce papers. The pressure of the pen was so intense that it indented the next 3 pages. He was not casually jotting down thoughts during a break. He was pressing the ink into the fibers with immense physical force. The primary archivist turned to page 12. A loose scrap of paper fell from the binding. It was a receipt from a pharmacy in Las Vegas, dated August 9, 1977. This was exactly 1 week before his death. On the back of the receipt, Elvis had written a single name, Larry. Below the name, he drew a small circle with a cross through the center. Who was Larry, and why was his name marked for destruction? Larry Geller was his personal hairstylist and spiritual advisor. He was one of the very few people allowed in the upstairs bedroom. The team realized the Bible was serving a dual purpose. It was a spiritual shield, but it was also a ledger of suspicion. Elvis knew his mail was being opened by his management team. He knew his phone calls were being routed through a central switchboard at the estate. He needed a place where no bodyguard would dare to look. A holy book was the ultimate hiding spot. His entourage saw him holding it and assumed he was praying. In reality, he was documenting the people who were systematically draining his bank accounts. Suspense built in the room as the examiner turned to the book of Genesis. The margins here were clean. The young Elvis of the 1950s did not deface his books. He respected the text. He used a blue highlighter on verses about family and honor. The heavy writing only begins after his mother, Gladys, passed away. Her death broke something fundamental inside his psyche. The notes instantly changed from spiritual reflection to raw, human grief. Next to a verse about mourning, he scrawled, "The house is empty now." The team adjusted the high-definition cameras to capture the text along the inner gutter of the spine. Elvis had written vertical sentences that disappeared into the glue of the binding. To read them, the researchers had to use a medical endoscope. The tiny camera slid between the old threads of the book. On the monitor screen, letters began to resolve. The message was fragmented but clear. They are counting the days. The researchers went silent. The word "they" was underlined 4 times. Elvis was not suffering from a vague sense of unease. He was tracking a specific group of individuals who were monitoring his health. The date at the top of the column read June 3rd, 1977. This was the peak of his final tour. Audiences noticed he was slurring his words on stage. He was forgetting the lyrics to songs he had sung for 20 years. The public thought he was burning out. The notes prove he knew exactly what was happening to him. The team verified the handwriting timeline. The decay of his writing style matched the decline of his physical body. The notes were a real-time map of his collapse. The archivist turned the page to the historical books of the Old Testament. The ink there changed from blue to a dark, ominous red. The team prepared the infrared scanners for the next layer of text. They were about to uncover the exact names Elvis blamed for his isolation, deciphering the king's cursive. The high-intensity halogen lamps hummed softly as the forensic handwriting analyst adjusted her microscope. The machine zoomed in on a single capital letter M written in the upper margin of Exodus. Under 60 times magnification, the blue ink told a story of profound physical decline. The stroke did not consist of a single, fluid motion. It was made of dozens of microscopic, jagged ridges. These ridges are called tremors. They appear when a writer's muscles are fighting severe neurological fatigue or heavy chemical sedation. The team needed to map the evolution of this handwriting to prove its authenticity. They brought out 3 authenticated signatures from different eras of Elvis's life to use as a baseline. The first sample was from 1956, signed on a standard military induction paper. The script there was bold, upright, and perfectly spaced. The second baseline was a contract from 1970, showing a slight tilt, but maintaining a clear, confident rhythm. Then, they looked back at the Bible margins. The contrast was absolutely jarring. The handwriting from his final years looked like it belonged to an entirely different human being. The letters were completely misshapen. Some words were compressed into tiny, unreadable knots of blue ink. Other lines stretched wildly across the page, tracking downward at an unnatural angle. Why did his writing deteriorate so rapidly? The analyst pointed to a specific note written next to a verse about physical blindness. Elvis had scrawled, "The light hurts my eyes today." This was not a metaphor. Medical records from early 1977 confirm Elvis was suffering from advanced glaucoma. The intense stage lights of his recent concerts were causing severe, stabbing pain in his cranium. He was forced to write these notes in near total darkness, using only the dim glow of a television set or a bedside lamp to guide his hand. The team turned the page to Leviticus. Here, the chaotic script suddenly stopped. It was replaced by 3 pages of perfectly neat, block printing. Elvis had abandoned his cursive entirely. He used a thick red felt tip pen to draw neat, square boxes around specific words in the text. This sudden shift in writing style usually indicates a moment of intense, forced clarity. What caused this sudden burst of meticulous organization? The investigator traced the red lines. They did not circle religious commands. Instead, they highlighted words related to legal judgments, broken oaths, and monetary fines. At the bottom of page 84, Elvis printed a single name in all capital letters, Mindy. The researchers immediately checked the historical log of Graceland employees and associates from that specific summer. No one named Mindy was listed on the official payroll or guest lists. Who was this person? This question has to do with when the archivist cross-referenced the name with Elvis's private telephone bills from July 1977. Mindy was the middle name of a legal secretary working for a prominent entertainment law firm in downtown Memphis. Elvis was not just reading his Bible. He was using a secret contact outside his inner circle to investigate his own finances. He print blocked her name so he would not forget it during moments of heavy memory loss induced by his prescriptions. The notes reveal he was tracking a massive discrepancy in his record royalties. He wrote, 3 million missing from the European tour sales. The handwriting analysis proved this specific note was written in a state of absolute focus. The lines were straight. The ink was evenly distributed. This completely dismantles the historical narrative that Elvis was completely detached from reality during his final months. He was fully aware that his wealth was leaking away. He was actively auditing his managers from his bed, using a hidden contact to gather the paperwork. But his physical body was failing him, even as his mind fought back. The analyst flipped the page, and the neat block printing dissolved back into the jagged, trembling script. On page 92, the ink became smeared with a greasy substance. The infrared camera revealed the outline of a thumbprint pressing over a note that read, "My hands will not obey me." The physical effort required to write these words must have been agonizing. The analyst noted that the pen had punctured the paper completely in 5 separate locations on this single page. Elvis was pressing down with immense force, trying to stabilize his shaking wrist by jamming the metal tip deep into the wood pulp fibers. He was running out of physical strength, and he knew it. The suspense tightened as the researchers realized the timeline was compressing. The notes were getting closer together in the text, indicating that his writing sessions were becoming more frequent as August approached. He was filling every square inch of white space with data, numbers, and names. It was a race against his own failing nervous system. The lead investigator carefully turned to the historical books of the Old Testament. The forensic light showed that the ink types were changing again. Elvis had switched from his standard ballpoint to a fountain pen filled with permanent black India ink. This was the ink he used for signing official documents. The tone of the notes was about to shift from financial tracking to a raw, first-hand account of psychological warfare inside the walls of his home. Paranoia, written in blue ink. The overhead magnifying lights hummed softly as the team turned to the historical books of the Old Testament. Here, the tone of the notes shifts from private terror to an explicit documentation of a conspiracy. Elvis was a prisoner inside his own home. Graceland was a fortress surrounded by high stone walls and a massive security force. Yet, inside his private upstairs suite, he felt entirely exposed to the world. He used a thick blue ballpoint pen to transform the margins into a diary of suspicion. The margins are flooded with direct references to constant surveillance. He writes about the walls having ears. He mentions telephone lines clicking in the dead of night. One specific note in the first book of Kings sends a visible chill through the research room. The circle grows smaller. Elvis is referring to his famous inner circle, the Memphis Mafia. This was a group of trusted childhood friends, cousins, and employees who lived on his payroll and traveled with him everywhere. Why did he suddenly turn against his closest companions? The official history states that Elvis grew increasingly isolated due to health struggles, but his personal writings tell a much more calculated story. He began to notice details that did not add up. Next to a verse describing a king being betrayed by his closest advisors, Elvis wrote a specific time and location. Upstairs office, 3 in the morning, he was tracking physical movements inside his house. He realized that information about his private health struggles and his financial problems was leaking directly to the tabloid press. He knew someone was selling his secrets. Elvis used his Bible to process this agonizing realization. He began to hide modern names inside the printed text. The handwriting analyst zoomed in on a passage in the book of Samuel. A small name was written inside the loops of a printed capital letter. The script was tiny, hidden by a deliberate smear of oil. The team utilized an infrared camera to see through the residue. The letters stabilized on the high-definition monitor screen. The name reads, Charlie. The researchers looked at each other in total silence. Charlie Hodge was Elvis's most trusted friend on the road. He was the man who handed him his acoustic guitars and his water scarves on stage during every single performance. He lived at Graceland in a room just down the hall from Elvis's master suite. He had total access to the king's private life. Did Elvis truly believe his most loyal companion was working against him? The note continues lower down the same page, written vertically along the spine. He takes the envelopes from the man in the dark suit. This is not the rambling of a sick mind. It is a direct accusation of financial betrayal. Elvis was actively documenting physical exchanges of cash happening on his own property. He was watching his friends from the shadows of his dark staircase. The team cross-references this note with financial records from 1977. During that exact summer, two of his former bodyguards were preparing to publish a scandalous tell-all book about his private life. Elvis knew the book was coming. He knew the information could only come from someone still inside the house. He used his Bible to record his suspicions because he knew his private diaries would be seized by his handlers. The paranoia was rooted in physical observations. He was documenting specific names, dates, and locations of clandestine meetings. The king of rock and roll was completely running out of people he could trust. He realized that his wealth had turned him into a target for the people he loved. As the team prepares to turn the page to the next major section, the writing changes again, the anger disappears. It is replaced by a profound, crushing sense of human sorrow, shaking the foundations of a myth. A fragile piece of folded parchment slipped out from the Book of Revelation during a private viewing in late October. The paper fluttered through the chilly air of the archive room before landing face up on the polished mahogany table. The lead archivist froze with his metal tweezers raised halfway in the air while his assistant drew a sharp breath. Thick black ink bled heavily through the fibers of the fragile scrap paper, indicating a heavy hand. Elvis had torn this page from a hotel notepad during his final tour. Two words were written across the top in jagged, panicked capital letters. The note read, "The Imposter," written with incredible force. Who was the world's greatest superstar talking about when he penned that brutal title? For decades, mainstream music biographers claimed Elvis loved the theatrical nature of his massive stage persona until his last breath. They wrote endless chapters about his pride in the glittering jumpsuits and the roaring crowds. This hidden scrap of paper proved the exact opposite to the stunned researchers. Elvis felt completely trapped inside a plastic myth of his own creation. He wrote a brief, devastating sentence right beneath that chilling title. He wrote that the man on stage was murdering the man on the inside. The date stamped on the notepad matched his final tour in June of 1977. He was performing 3 massive stadium shows a week to sold-out arenas filled with screaming fans. On stage, he forced himself to smile, shake hands, and hand out scarves. Back in his dressing room, he hid behind heavy locked doors with this exact Bible. He stared directly at the warnings in Revelation about the worship of false idols. He drew a heavy ink square around a verse about public worship. Then, he pointed a sharp arrow toward his own name. Did Elvis genuinely believe his global fame was an unforgivable sin against the heavens? The notes in the margins show a man terrified of the massive machinery driving his daily life. He looked out at the blinding stadium lights and saw a cage. He wrote about the loud applause sounding like painful static in his ears. He could not escape the caricature that his management team had constructed over 20 years. The legendary king of rock and roll wanted to destroy the king. He needed Elvis the man to finally breathe. He left a specific list of financial instructions on the reverse side of that yellowed notepad. He wrote down 4 major assets that he wanted his accountants to liquidate in total secrecy. He listed his beloved private airplane alongside 3 separate bank accounts held in Memphis and Nashville. He was preparing a massive financial move while his managers slept in neighboring rooms. He wanted to vanish completely from the face of the earth. He even drew a map of a small property near the coast, where he hoped to find a quiet sanctuary. Why did he suddenly stop this elaborate escape plan before the month of June concluded? The tragic answer sits in the final margin note written at the bottom of the paper. He wrote the single word, "to," followed by a long, shaky blue line. The line ran completely off the edge of the sheet. He simply ran out of physical energy before he could execute the complicated logistics. The commercial system surrounding his career was far too large and aggressive for a tired man to break alone. The archivists stared at the hotel paper under the bright studio lamps for a long time. They realized Elvis was actively planning his own total disappearance rather than waiting for an early grave. He did not want to die on that bathroom floor in August. He wanted to walk away from the cameras, the contracts, and the greedy managers. He wanted to drop the microphone forever to pick up a simple life. The world never let him make that choice, leaving these notes as the final evidence. The Midnight Revelations. The clock struck midnight when the research team uncovered the next layer of secrets hidden within the old leather binding. They turned past the heavy prophetic books to find a series of deeply personal entries dated from the sticky, humid weeks of August. This was the final stretch of his life, a period history remembers as a time of total isolation behind the gates of his estate. The bright fluorescent lights of the research lab hummed softly as the lead historian positioned a powerful magnifying glass over the page. Under the lens, the bright blue ink appeared heavily blurred and faded in several key places. Someone had spilled liquid across the page long ago, causing the handwriting to run into the sacred text like dark veins. A forensic fluid analysis conducted days later confirmed the stains were actually salt water from human tears. What drove the most famous entertainer in human history to weep over his scriptures in the dead of night? The margin notes from August 12th reveal a man grappling with an intense, paralyzing fear of his own mortality. He was scheduled to fly out for yet another exhausting multi-city stadium tour in just 4 days. His body was failing him, his heart was straining, and the sheer pressure of keeping hundreds of people employed weighed heavily on his mind. He highlighted a verse in the New Testament that spoke directly about the vanity of gaining the whole world while losing your own soul. Right next to those ancient words, he scribbled a frantic midnight confession that changed how experts viewed his final days. He wrote that his body felt like a crumbling temple, and he feared he would not survive the upcoming month. This was not the drug-induced haze that previous historical accounts often describe with cold detachment. The handwriting throughout this specific section was remarkably steady, deliberate, and packed with an intense, lucid focus. He was cataloging his deepest spiritual anxieties with the precision of a man who knew his remaining time was incredibly short. He questioned whether the millions of fans cheering his name actually loved him or simply loved the plastic image on the posters. In a striking entry dated August 14th, he noted that the applause felt entirely hollow when the curtain closed. He felt completely alone in a crowded room, isolated by a level of fame that no human being was ever designed to carry. The text shows he spent those final midnights desperately searching for an authentic connection to something larger than his own myth. The small questions surrounding his final hours began to resolve themselves as the team read further into the night. For decades, critics wondered why Elvis never canceled that final fatal tour if he knew his health was in such terrible condition. The answer was written in tiny, cramped letters along the lower margin of a page concerning financial debts and obligations. Elvis explicitly stated that he felt completely bound by contracts he had signed with aggressive promoters years prior. He wrote that he was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and the keys were held by men who only saw him as a commercial product. He felt a profound, crushing duty to perform, believing that thousands of working-class families depended on his nightly shows to pay their bills. His devotion to his crew was ultimately the anchor that prevented him from walking away into a quiet retirement. Then, the researchers stumbled upon a larger, far more unsettling question that carried over from his previous notes on the hotel notepad. Did someone in his immediate circle discover these midnight writings before he had a chance to hide the book away? On the page facing his final tear-stained entry, someone had drawn a small, crude cross in dark red ink that did not match Elvis's pen's. This mysterious red marking appeared right next to a verse detailing the betrayal of a close friend in an orchard. Elvis had underlined that specific verse 3 separate times, with his usual blue ballpoint pen, cutting deep into the paper. The presence of the second ink color suggests that a silent observer was tracking his spiritual journey through the pages. Someone else was reading his private thoughts while he slept in the dark rooms upstairs. The atmosphere in the archive room grew incredibly tense as the historians realized the full scope of this late-night discovery. They were no longer just looking at a collection of random religious reflections from a dying rock star. They were looking at a real-time diary of a high-stakes psychological drama playing out behind the closed doors of a guarded mansion. Elvis was using the holy book as a secure vault to store his raw, unedited fears about the people closest to him. He suspected that his telephone lines were being tapped, and his private conversations were being monitored by outside security. The margins of his Bible became the only place where he could speak his mind without facing immediate corporate consequences. It was his final stronghold, a silent confidant that kept his secrets safe for nearly 50 long years. As the midnight session drew to a close, the team carefully documented the physical condition of the August entries for the official record. They took high-resolution digital photographs of every single smudge, tear stain, and blurred ink stroke to preserve the evidence. the final line of this section contained a sudden, chilling break in his thought process that left the researchers entirely speechless. He began writing a sentence about finding peace in the darkness, but the pen suddenly dragged sharply. The ink trail stretched across the page in a jagged line, as if the pen was dropped in a hurry. The thought was never finished, leaving a stark, empty space at the bottom of the ancient parchment. It looked as though the writer had been suddenly interrupted by a loud knock at the heavy bedroom door. The researchers turned off the overhead lights, knowing they had just uncovered a direct map of the king's final hours. The handwriting experts speak. The high-resolution digital scans of the August entries arrived at a top forensic laboratory in Chicago early the following Tuesday morning. A team of 3 independent handwriting experts gathered around a massive electronic monitor to examine the microscopic details of the ink strokes. They needed to verify the authenticity of the frantic blue script before releasing any formal reports to the estate trustees. The lead analyst used a specialized software program to measure the exact pressure and slant of every individual letter on the page. Within 20 minutes, the advanced imaging software detected a massive structural anomaly in the stroke patterns that shocked the entire room. What did the forensic software uncover lurking inside the margins of the king's personal book? The computer algorithm proved that while Elvis wrote the main body of the blue notes, someone else had added a series of tiny hidden markings. A second, highly disciplined hand had carefully traced over certain words to alter their original meaning entirely. This unknown writer used an identical blue ballpoint pen to mimic the superstar's chaotic handwriting style with terrifying precision. The expert pointed his laser pen at a specific phrase in the Book of Psalms, where the rhythm of the ink lines changed completely. The original note written by the singer had been subtly adjusted to make his clear, lucid thoughts look entirely insane. Who possessed the incredible skill and the intimate physical access required to tamper with the singer's most private spiritual sanctuary? The team began comparing the forged strokes against a database of handwriting samples from everyone living at the mansion in 1977. They checked the script of his closest family members, his live-in girlfriends, and the medical staff who administered his daily treatments. The matching profile did not belong to a relative or a medical professional looking after his failing health. The precise geometric slant of the forged letters perfectly matched the handwriting of a senior member of his own corporate security detail. This discovery meant that the highest levels of his management team were actively spying on his private religious thoughts. The corporate handlers were not just monitoring his health, they were actively gaslighting the entertainer to protect their financial investments. They saw his growing desire to liquidate his massive assets and walk away from his contract as a direct threat to their kingdom. If Elvis vanished into a quiet private life, the touring machine would grind to an immediate halt. They used their security clearance to slip into his dark bedroom while he was away downstairs in the recording studio. They found his hidden Bible, read his secret escape plans, and used their pens to distort his words for future legal battles. They wanted to have concrete proof of mental instability, ready in case he actually tried to break his legal agreements. The small question of who altered the book was solved, but a much larger, more terrifying question quickly took its place. Did Elvis ever realize that his trusted security team was actively weaponizing his private diary against his own future? The handwriting analysts found the answer hidden in a tiny, defensive note written on the very last page of the chapter. Elvis had scribbled a brief paranoid warning to himself near the bottom edge of the paper on August 15th. He wrote that the shadows in the hallway were moving even when the house was completely quiet at night. He knew someone was entering his room, but his failing health made it impossible to prove his growing suspicions. The Chicago forensic team finalized their official report and stamped it with a red seal of absolute security later that afternoon. They had set out to authenticate a simple historical artifact, but they ended up uncovering a corporate conspiracy against a dying icon. The myth of the pampered, out-of-touch rock star was completely dismantled by the hard science on the monitor screens. Elvis Presley was a man living under a state of total corporate siege during the final 48 hours of his life. He was fighting for his personal freedom, using the only silent weapon he had left in his possession. The experts packed up their equipment in silence, deeply unsettled by the dark reality behind the glittering legend. The final verdict on the king's soul. The final pages of the leather Bible were laid flat under the ultraviolet lamps on the last night of the investigation. The research team held their breath as they turned to the very back of the book where the blank pages sat. History has recorded August 16, 1977, as a day of pure tragedy, chaos, and sudden loss. The public narrative always maintained that the superstar spent his last hours completely lost in a haze of drug-induced despair. Yet, the final authentic entry written in his true handwriting paints a completely different picture of that morning. In the quiet hours before dawn, Elvis picked up his pen for one last definitive statement to the world. He chose a clean white space beneath the final index to leave a message of ultimate triumph. What was the final word that the king of rock and roll underlined before closing the book forever? The experts found a single verse about breaking the chains of earthly bondage heavily underlined in thick blue ink. Right next to it, Elvis wrote his own final verdict on his life with absolute clarity and calm. He wrote that his soul was finally free from the corporate prison and the fake lights of the stage. He did not write with fear, and his hand did not shake as it had in the previous weeks. The letters were bold, upright, and written with a sudden surge of physical energy that stunned the analysts. He had found a sense of peace that his managers could never take away from him. The small question of his true state of mind on his final night was resolved in that single sentence. He was not a helpless victim, crying in the dark during those last few hours of his earthly life. He had consciously reclaimed his own personal agency and separated his true self from the massive commercial myth. The margins showed that he used his final moments to forgive the people who had actively betrayed his trust. He wrote a brief prayer for his fans, his family, and even the security guards who spied on him. He knew his physical heart was failing, but he viewed the end as a rescue. Then the lead archivist noticed one final piece of physical evidence pressed deeply into the fibers of the paper. A faint, clear thumbprint was left in oil near the bottom corner of the very last page he signed. Forensic testing confirmed the print belonged to the singer, left there as he closed the heavy cover for the night. It was his final, permanent seal on a diary that had kept him alive through his darkest years. The discovery completely changes everything the world thought it knew about the tragic end of the American icon. The historical implications of this final entry began to sink in for the researchers as the morning light broke. For 50 years, the public believed that the entertainment industry had completely destroyed the inner life of the legend. This document proves that Elvis Presley fought back against his handlers, using his deep, private faith as a shield. He managed to secure his own legacy in writing before anyone else could control the narrative of his death. The secret codes in the margins were not cries for help, but notes of an ultimate victory. The archivists quietly closed the heavy leather cover and placed the artifact back into its secure, climate-controlled vault. They knew that the world would never look at the tragic story of Graceland the same way again. The man who had given everything to his fans had saved the very best part of himself for the end. He left behind a roadmap of his survival, a hidden message of hope for anyone else trapped in a cage. The true king had finally spoken his mind, and his final words were filled with absolute peace. The private archives have finally closed, but the real story of Elvis Presley is just beginning to surface. The notes left in the margins of his hidden Bible prove that the man behind the myth was far greater than the character on the stage. He fought a quiet, heroic battle for his own freedom until his very last breath behind those closed doors. If you want to uncover more hidden truths about history's biggest legends, make sure to hit the subscribe button right now. Turn on your notifications so you never miss our next high-stakes investigation into the secrets of the stars.